Stephanie, thanks very much. Plenty in this morning's papers about security in the Commons, the Liberal Democrat conference, which is about to start in Bournemouth, and many other things as well. Joining me now, down the line in Wales, is the Leader of the House of Commons, Peter Hain. Peter Hain, thanks very much indeed for coming in this morning.
It's a pleasure, Steve. Good morning.
Good morning to you. Could we begin with that Liberal Democrat conference? How serious a threat, in your view, are the Liberal Democrats to the Labour Party in what's likely to be this pre-election conference season?
Well, the Lib Dems are at their highest in the electoral cycle for many years, possibly since the heyday of the SDP Liberal Alliance in the early 80s. And as some of their results have shown in the local elections, they've basically, in some places, a much more serious threat than the Tories. So we've got to take them seriously. And I think this is a good thing, because we can start exposing their policies. There are two things about their policies which are very striking. First of all, there's this shift to the right, which is really marked. Tough liberalism, it's called. Well, it's crypto-Thatcherism, in my view, when you talk about market reforms in the National Health Service, you talk about stripping all the protection out of the Department of Trade and Industry and cutting budgets there, when you talk about abolishing the New Deal, which has brought 1 million people back into the opportunity for work, abolishing child trust funds, which are giving youngsters from poor backgrounds an asset at the start of their adult life. There's a whole list of very right-wing policies that the Liberal Democrats are now pursuing on the one hand, and on the other, it's shameless populism, because they say one thing at a local level, for example, rail against local crime, but then in the House of Commons, when a Labour government puts through tough measures curbing antisocial behaviour, which terrorises young people in many situations, and particularly working class communities on estates, they vote against them. So they're completely and shamelessly opportunist on the one hand, but moving very steadily to the right on the other. That's not surprising.
It's very interesting to hear that analysis, because one or two of the papers have picked up today. It seems that they've confused all of you in a way, because Tony Blair tends to attack them, implying they're to the left of New Labour, reckless high spenders, whereas you are saying they are to the right.
Actually,
who's right between you and Tony Blair on that?
Well, we're both right, because they're two...
That's how they've got you confused.
There are two dimensions to this. Their costs don't add up. They've promised huge spending commitments on health and long-term care. Their university finance, their sums are all over the place. And indeed, we saw this only recently, when, having promised to abolish the Department of Trade and Industry and said that around £8 billion would be available to spend elsewhere, they then discovered that included the science budget, which will be going up to £3 billion under Labour. It included employment protection. It included a lot of other things, which they're now shuffling off to other departments. And in the case of consumer credit, creating a new department.
Okay,
so their sums don't add up on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a clear move to the right, which I think those voters who, whether it's disgruntled over Iraq or some other issue, think they can send a message to us as a Labour government by voting Lib Dem, would then find themselves saddled with not only a party that's more right-wing than they think, but actually they could let Tory MPs into the back door in marginal Tory Labour seats, which where the key election battleground will be fought next time.
But nonetheless, do you accept that with Iraq, many of your voters in 2001 and 97 are disgruntled, and on that, the Liberal Democrats were absolutely clear. They were opposed to it. So if the war is the issue that worries some of your voters, they will vote for the Liberal Democrats, however they are positioned on all these other issues.
Well, if they do that in sufficiently large numbers, particularly in those seats which will determine what happens at the next general election, then we could get a situation in which those very disgruntled Labour supporters on Iraq or whatever it might be then find themselves with a Tory MP they don't want.
You accept that that is a possibility and a danger for the Labour Party?
Well, I'm saying that if Labour supporters, natural Labour supporters, who 8 years into government feel disgruntled, and frankly, what government hasn't ever provoked disgruntlement when they've been this long in power, or whether it's over Iraq, if they think that they can send a message in safety and still get a Labour government with a clear majority, they may wake up with a rude shock and find themselves replicated across the country with Tory MPs, without the Tories doing well. I think the biggest danger to Labour now is that people are writing off the Tory party. because Michael Howard's leadership imploded over the summer. Their policies are all over the place. They've got rid of moderate frontbenchers and brought in John Redwood, showing they're moving to the right, back to where William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith were so disastrously for them. And so they're losing credibility, and that has created a sense of flux in which some natural Labour supporters who would be horrified to have the threat of a Tory government again might think that they can in safety vote Lib Dem, thinking they're a progressive party, whereas as I've explained, they're actually lurching to the right, and end up with a Tory MP in their constituency that they don't want.
OK, that's very clear in your approach to the election of the Lib Dems. Could I ask you on a specific? These extraordinary leaks from the Foreign Office in the build-up to the war against Iraq. You were in the Foreign Office for part of that time, in which Tony Blair was clearly warned by Jack Straw and senior Foreign Office officials that the war could have all kinds of dangerous consequences in Iraq that needed to be thought through more fully. And, well, what's your reaction to those documents? I think you're the first cabinet minister to give a reaction. What are they?
Well, I think the Prime Minister commented yesterday on it, but I was in the Foreign Office at the time. I don't recall this document, but there we are. It seems to be all over the papers. Really, the important thing for me is not what thinking went on in the Foreign Office quite properly about future situations 2 years ago. What matters now is how Iraq moves forward. And there's a very clear choice for people. Do you back those who want to unravel the whole building of a democratic Iraq, the fact that there are now 250 health centers rolled out across the country, that 300,000 teachers are teaching 6 million school students in 20,000 schools, the fact that the economy is recovering, that oil output is up, and that $7.5 billion of revenues are pouring in to help rebuild Iraq, alongside a Prime Minister who's visiting Britain shortly and will be meeting with our Prime Minister. Who would have imagined this could have happened only a couple of years ago when this paper was being written? And what's more is, under United Nations Resolution 1546, commitment to early elections in January next year. The prospect before us is a democratic Iraq. That's what we must focus on, rather than playing into the hands of those who want to destabilize the situation.
But you must acknowledge that that is not the full picture at all. I appreciate you think the full picture, the rosier side, is not presented, but you must also acknowledge the appalling number of deaths, the hostages, the terrorism, as Tony Blair once put it, flooding in. In retrospect, could the government have done more? Could Tony Blair have done more by following the advice from your own Foreign Office, which warned about thinking through more carefully the consequences of war?
The Prime Minister was fully aware of the consequences of war and the risks and the dangers of precisely the situation we have now. And the Cabinet was. I remember these issues being discussed in the Cabinet, and I remember when before that I was in the Foreign Office at the time this paper was apparently written. I remember there was a live discussion. You don't go into these situations, especially with such a brilliant Foreign Office with all its long experience and expertise, without scoping out where you're going. But I don't think the issue is what should or shouldn't have happened with hindsight. In a sense, what has been characteristic of the last 18 months or so of debate, Steve, and I have always acknowledged honest differences of opinion on this issue, including people very close to me, including in the Labour Party. The point is, we are where we are now, and there are two routes forward for Iraq. Yes, you're quite right to point out a moment ago that the security situation is very unstable. Terrorists and their supporters are trying to destabilize this whole democratic future for Iraq, which will create a secular, democratic Iraqi society, and what a fantastic achievement that would be. There's that prospect, or there's the prospect of Iraq descending into, as it were, a terrorist fiefdom. Now, everybody's got to be very clear on whose side they're on in that choice.
OK. Could we move on? Well, it's almost related to this, to the whole issue of commons security. Now, you gave some very robust comments about the need for the whole situation to be overhauled in the light of what happened last week. Tony Blair has been much more modest in his response, so you've got to be very careful about how we approach this and how we deal with the House of Commons. Clarify your situation. Do you agree with him? Modest change, and be careful not to cordon the whole place off, or are you sticking by your original statement that a radical overhaul of security is necessary?
Well, I admire you as a journalist, Steve, but I think you're trying to, as it were, nitpick about statements here. The Prime Minister and I are in exactly the same position as David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, has made clear over the last 48 hours. We all want to see public access to the House of Commons preserved as a fundamental principle. Voters, citizens have a right to come in, meet their members of Parliament, see their democracy at work. But they want to be sure that it's in conditions of security and safety. And I can assure you that at the Cabinet meeting on Thursday morning, we were all in the same position of wanting to see House of Commons security radically improved. We've seen in the incidents last week, preceded by the flower bomb attack and then the scaling of Big Ben, we've seen that the security is not acceptable. Nobody wants a fortress House of Commons. As leader of the House of Commons, that's the last thing I want. I want a secure one in which public access is preserved and, by the way, in which the right to protest in the vicinity of the House of Commons is preserved as well. So I think we